So this is similar in the Cuban sense that, so to speak, the Nganga as this entire ensemble of matter and spirit, sort of actually has kind of linkages through these, for example, ingestion of, substances and, sharing of blood and, contents and whatnot with humans. It begins to sort of ramify into this kind of, rhizomatic, whatever. But the point of this, at the same token, is that, they are dangerous. Because, they are, and that's again possibly a reference to slavery, because they can actually revolt. And, this very thing about, sort of feeding them your own blood, you're supposed to do it only once in the beginning to establish the kind of consociality, but they might actually acquire a taste for it and just kill you. And there's, in an article I, wrote about these, Palo Monte, I cited a story that I picked up in Miami about Nganga, which they all have names, and this one was called Avísame con tiempo, Warn Me in Time. And it was in the possession of a drug dealer, who of course needed that kind of protection. But at one point, in order to, bind the Nganga more closely to him, the story went that the guy started feeding the Nganga lines of cocaine. In order to, the idea was to enhance dependency, but of course, as it so happens, sort of, the Nganga joined the owner in the kind of fatal pattern of overconsumption that, finally led to, his suppliers and creditors do him in. But that would have been easily interpretable as kind of the kind of thing that you do not do with such an entity, that you are actually in a very, it's not a subject-object relation. So, domination is always precarious. And also, they do, in a sense, over time, people and the dead with whom they work, they have ongoing, evolving joint biographies, so to speak. And you can actually sort of partly read this out of, if you know how to read it, it's really hard unless somebody explains it to you. You can sort of read it out of, sort of the remnants of specific works that they undertook together for somebody else, for example. And this could include healing works, too, So, then, the client gets implicated in that whole story too, because something of the client, the name or whatever, remains on the object. And so this is kind of like a buildup of, the kind of sociality between the dead and the living that is, I think it's very fascinating, but it's really hard to characterize. Recently I've been sort of thinking about, all of this literature about, the, entanglement between us and our machines, for example, where, that may be, sort of, it may be something of an analogy where, sort of, think about the movie She, where sort of our technology has become so much part of ourselves that we begin to think of our personhood as distributed over not just our body, but certain, techno-material, appurtenances that we surround ourselves with, I know why I don't do social media.
So, just one quick question. So, seeing as you've been accused of being a dialectician, what is this distinction going on between signal and noise? It seems to be a pretty hard distinction, because I'm thinking about some of the recent literature in Gangas, and it seems to be that the privileging of noise in Gangas over the signifying possibility of it. But in the way you present it, the noise is the deadlock. There's a kind of historical deadlock which we're excluded out of. So you don't seem to find the noise productive in your...
Well, that depends how you frame it. I'm strictly framing it in, in terms of Shannon's mathematical theory of communication, that, sort of, the increase of redundancy in the signal, sort of, kind of splits it off from the noise out of which, sort of you want to lift it, so to speak. And, the metaphor is less pertaining to, the aesthetics or ethics or whatever of Palo Monte, as enabling this contrast between, you know, the kind of what is noise for archaeologists is signal for paleros and vice versa. You know, so that's where that metaphor, you know, where I want it to work. But one could, of course, as for example, you know, Todd Ochoa does, talk about, even though in his case there is a kind of distinction as well, because, you know, sort of he talks about this, the ambient dead, which are, you know, sort of this, you know, incredibly,
The turbulence.
yeah, the turbulence, all noise, you know, so around, you know, so you sort of feel it when, you know, sort of you get goosebumps and, or, you know, or other kind of inexplicable sensations. But here too, in order to actually work with the dead, you have to sort of lift one of them out of this kind of, you know, ambient, you know, sort of turbulent sea of dead that, you know, that washes around us all the time, and that, you know, sort of, you know, I have no way of acknowledging, but certainly is, you know, then when you sort of see it, you know, objectified in, or, you know, one of them in this kind of, you know, sort of gruesome-looking power object, then you know, I mean, there's a vast, you know, sort of, I mean, graveyards you can, you know, consider sort of like oceans where you can dive, and I mean, that would be my closest approximation to Ochoa's imagery, where you can dive in and, you know, fish, in a sense, for what you, you know, what you want.
Okay, yes.
Throughout your career, thank you, first of all,
Sure.
very stimulating lecture. And I started to think about the running themes in your publications. And then you have focused a great deal on metaphor. And from Aristotle on, of course, metaphor reveals as well as conceals. And I can just link that to today's lecture, the negative evidence and then all of that. I think your hybridity, and we discussed during the AAA that I was writing against the metaphor hybridity. And then the cooking you took from Ortiz. And so this is very, incidentally, anybody, his book, The Cooking of History, was very favorably reviewed as the first review in American Anthropology, so you might want to take a look at that. But anyway, so what I'm seeing is that you are more or less trying to counter positivist interpretation of the past, and then also what culture, quote unquote, which you have been arguing in terms of the local and the global interactions. So maybe what I would like to see is how your thinking is going in terms of that which is concealed rather than revealed, negative evidence, and is there anything you could tell us that the direction, theoretical direction that you're going, which sounds fascinating?
All right. Well, thank you for you know, your question, Emiko, and thanks also for you know, doing a little bit of advertising on my book. Always very welcome, and it is a very nice review, I must say. Yes, I mean there are a couple of questions. You know, I think, or a couple of answers to your question, which was a complex one. I mean, what I try to do in this paper, and in, you know, as I said in the beginning, in a couple of other pieces that I wrote, which have a, you know, similar tendency, so to speak, is engineer some kind of a, I guess, Latour or Latourian or, you know, Edinburgh's strong program symmetry between what is, you know, ostensibly, what are ostensibly very, very different kinds of practices and forms of knowledge production. And you know, a certain type of, you know, metaphor is a good tool for doing precisely that. And of course, one can do it in a more or less disciplined fashion. And as you say, a metaphor reveals as well as conceals. And, you know, many types of, you know, disciplined knowledge production operate with implicit metaphors that are, you know, that we could call fairly dead in the conventional semantic sense. That is, they're not acknowledged as such. You know, sort of the what Jim Fernandez long ago called movement in quality space is no longer really perceived as occurring. It's just, you know, that's the fate of dead metaphors, that we don't perceive them as such. And those, of course, the dead ones, are particularly good occulters. You know, they just hide whatever we, you know, we no longer perceive as relevant, because we've naturalized the metaphor. And this is very often the case, for example, when we as lay people talk about economics, for example. You know, so it's full of, economic talk is full of metaphors. And most of them we treat as fairly dead. I mean, it's like when, you know, Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. But, you know, what is that? I mean, you know, it's a totally, you know, the product of hypostasis in the rhetorical sense, you know. Sort of suddenly something that, you know, maybe Adam Smith still, or, you know, classical political economy conceived of as human relations, such suddenly, you know, sort of becomes object to a kind of semantic fetishism that Marx would have recognized very well, but, you know, that we in our everyday speech, you know, do not recognize anymore. I mean, the economy does this, does that, you know, sort of does stuff to our lives, but what the economy is thereby occluded, you know. So, metaphors, and, you know, even if we don't perceive, especially if we don't perceive them as such, can do all kinds of intriguing work in terms of, for example, I mean, silencing in Rolf Triot's sense, you know. So in a sense, you know, many forms of knowledge production have their counterpart of, you know, the production in the sense of ignorance or non-knowledge. And that's, of course, the other part, what interests me here, you know, so that, you know, it's not just, you know, well, positive disciplinary social science produces certain visions, descriptions of the world that may actually hide other possible descriptions. And we see this in the history of our discipline. You know, when we, you know, when it, you know, for example, in terms of major shifts, let's say, you know, the shift from, you know, shift that occurred, let's say, in the anthropology of kinship, when suddenly African lineage theory was confronted with, you know, South Pacific, you know, New Guinea material, Melanesianist material, which, you know, just literally destroyed it in many ways. Or you can see it, you know, in the kind of, you know, 1980s, you know, fall from grace, where, you know, suddenly everybody started, you know, sort of getting terribly obsessed about the ethnographer's subjectivity, which had played no role whatsoever. Other than, for example, other than perhaps in, you know, sort of Evans Pritchard's lovely side remarks in his, you know, various works, but cherchez la vache, and, you know, that kind of stuff. But I mean, so that, you know, even in our discipline, it's very obvious, and, you know, the same thing, of course, also holds for history, where, you know, while you might think that different historical narratives would add up to a greater synthesis, sometimes they actually cancel each other out, which, you know, is known as, you know, historical revision, where suddenly, you know, the past looks totally different than what it was before. And there are various other ways in which one can sort of, and domains in which one can play these, you know, now you see it, now you don't games. And that's something, you know, as with, you know, hybridity, for example, you know, it really sort of depends upon, you know, what you constitute as pure that makes you even see the hybrid. You know, so, you know, I wrote we were in touch about the matter then a years ago, maybe last year actually, it was published an article about Mixed Blessings and Sorrowful Mysteries, Second Thoughts about Hybridity, where I used the rather frivolous example at one point of dog breeding standards and the American Canine Hybrid Association, which produces gigantic catalogs of Labradoodles, Schnockers, Schnoodles, Bagel Hounds, and whatnot, which really are can be constituted as such only on the basis of the American Kennel Club's classification of pure breeds. And the problem with that is that this may seem like wonderfully ludic play on classificatory madness in the dog breeders world. The problem is that you can't just put a poodle and a schnauzer together and produce and expect the two of them to produce schnoodles because they will not breed true. So the production of these designer dogs is just as much a work on the material of the world as this seemingly arbitrary classifying of dog breeds that have not even been around for that long. I mean, if you go back to, for example, the book of St. Albans, lists lists bastard as a breed of dog among 5 others. Well, it tells you something. I mean, the classificatory imagination is yet another one of those devices that that produce, representations of the world, or worlds that we can sort of navigate because we can't really do without categories. But these categories, are not the only possible ones. And the more we naturalize the ones that we operate with, the more others will become invisible. And this holds not just for the standard day-to-day practice of engaging our social life worlds, but it also holds for scholarly pursuits as well. So,
Catherine.
So I enjoyed the talk very much. I've been thinking all the time, and mainly I've been thinking about bones and what everybody does with them. And along the lines of Maria, I was thinking about bones in Thailand, of course, the center of the universe, and their bones of monks get made into amulets.
mm-hmm.
Fetuses get made into exotic things. So they're interesting worlds that thinking about this opens up. But in the very beginning of your talk, so this is the contrarian part now,
Mm-hmm.
you were talking about Western forms of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, to what extent is the archaeological quest for artifacts a representation of Western forms of knowledge? So nowadays in the United States, a lot of people are being cremated.
Mm-hmm.
We can think of lots of examples of, in Switzerland, there wasn't enough space to keep bodies for very long. So every 20 years, the graves
Uh-huh.
get dug up
Mhm.
and you stick new ones in. So in what way is archaeology representative of a Western paradigm?
Well, I'm sort of thinking about, a kind of historicist-oriented archaeology that will, like any form of Western historicism, which, by and large, is not a view of the past that is terrifically old, even within the West. I mean, prior to probably the middle of the 18th century, Reinhard Koselleck and other people think the French Revolution was a constitutive event in the eventual advent of historicism as a broad philosophy of time in the 19th century. Prior to that, chronology, all kinds of other things that are anachronism. Look at, for example, Renaissance paintings of nativity scene where everybody's dressed like they just stepped out of a Florentine palazzo. This is not a problem, and so but anachronism becomes a problem from the 19th century on, and there were when you can talk about sort of historicist revolution of sorts. I mean, people have variously written about that, but so archaeology, in a sense, belongs in that paradigm, particularly once it begins, and the story of, for example, coincides with the downfall of the short biblical chronology under the impact of Lyell's geology. It relates to other forms of time reckoning that become socially far more prevalent, especially in urban areas of Europe and in the West in the 19th century. And they kind of displace forms of, temporality or thinking about the past, or I really like the word past relations that J.G.A. Pocock coined in 1962 and nobody ever picked up. But, they can be constituted in all kinds of different ways, rather than in terms of our linear chronological sense. And even our time that we experience is not really empty and homogeneous, as I think we all realize once we think about it twice. But if your example about and the one before, about ancestors or sacred figures, heroes and whatnot, whose remains are put into some form of social circulation, has in the West its equivalent, for example, in Catholic relics, which of course still populate churches all over Europe. My favorite is the Tongue of Saint Francis in Padua, but and they're agents in the world. I mean, the cult of saints is very much about these, remains of these extraordinary human beings, continuing on in material relations with the living through the grace of God. And I don't know enough about the theology of sainthood, but that would be, one example where, sort of it's, time is. And time and the threshold between the present and the past, and between the dead and the living, is kind of similarly disjointed, as in the case of Palo Monte, right? And that's probably far less anomalous than we would think. I mean, if you think about contemporary mortuary practices, sort of, you can have your body be turned into an industrial diamond that one of your descendants then can wear, and there's all kinds of rather interesting ways of planning your own bodily or I just read an article about for a journal about cryonics and their different conception of when death actually occurs, because it if you cut off the head fast enough and put it in the freezer, then death does not occur, and you can sort of then wait out a couple of hundred years until you sort of re-emerge like Woody Allen in The Sleeper. But that's so there's all kinds of ways in which once one really thinks about it, just only scratches the surface. Then, what Mannheim called the Weltanschauung of modernity, that is, historicism, is not as cohesively a kind of a panoply under which we live our lives. Not sure if I fully answered your question, but at least some thoughts about the matter.
We have 2 more questions. If anyone's desperate to ask a quick question, I can add you in, but this will be the final 2. Darryl first, and then Pablo.
Thank you very much for the talk. I wanted to ask about particularly the use of the term anti-archaeology rather than, say, non-archaeology or alter-archaeology. And if I understand your argument correctly, it's not simply that it's a different way of dealing with the past, it's an inversion, it's necessary mirror image, as you put it. But then I also wonder if that incommensurability or the inversion is as much with archaeology as it might be, say, with heritage, because incommensurability you were describing was particularly related to the archaeologists themselves do not always sit easily with nation and
Yeah.
heritage and world heritage and national
Oh, yeah.
heritage, which has a very different set of
Yeah.
priorities.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's another ontological and incommensurability between objective sciences with the path, which is what many scholarly archaeologists do, as opposed to a kind of national story or mythology that the nation wants to use the material
Yeah.
class for.
Yeah.
So is it anti-heritage or anti-archaeology? Because I'm not sure necessarily.
Yeah, no, I completely concede the point. I mean, although one has to say that modern archaeology largely comes out of this nationalist mold. I mean, when you think about descriptions of the Acropolis, and there are images of it, prior to the founding of the Greek nation state, or even before, prior to the arrival, let's say, of the British, on the scene, then, the place had a mosque inside of it. There was a Frankish tower on the Acropolis. There was a market in there, but all of this was gone by the time that the Brits and the Bavarians and, whoever else had, taught the Greeks that, they, ought to maybe disavow, a past that, was not properly the past of the Greek nation, but of their, foreign rulers and this, that, and the other. So, I mean, no Venetian stuff in there, no Turkish stuff in there, so it's got to be clean. And of course, what happened was massive destruction of historically interesting, we would say today, infrastructure. Same thing, a reference to slavery, because they can actually revolt. And this very thing about feeding them your own blood, you're supposed to do it only once in the beginning to establish the kind of consociality, but they might actually acquire a taste for it and just kill you. And there's in an article I wrote about these Palo Monte, I cited a story that I picked up in Miami about Nganga, which they all have names, and this one was called Avísame con tiempo, Warn Me in Time. And it was in the possession of a drug dealer. So this is similar in the Cuban sense that, so to speak, the Nganga as this entire ensemble of matter and spirit, actually has kind of linkages through these, for example, ingestion of, substances and, sharing of blood and, contents and whatnot with humans. It begins to sort of ramify into this kind of, rhizomatic, whatever. But the point of this, at the same token, is that, they are dangerous. Because, they are, and that's again possible together for somebody else, for example. And this could include healing works too, So, then, the client gets implicated in that whole story too, because something of the client, the name or whatever remains on the object. And so this is kind of like a buildup of, the kind of sociality between the dead and the living that is, I mean, I think it's very fascinating, but it's really hard to characterize. I mean, recently I've been sort of thinking about, all of this literature about, such an entity that you are actually in a very, I mean, it's not a subject-object relation. So, I mean, domination is always precarious. And also, they do, in a sense, over time, people and the dead with whom they work, they have ongoing, evolving joint biographies, so to speak. And you can actually sort of partly read this out of, if you know how to read it, it's really hard unless somebody explains it to you. You can sort of read it out of, sort of the remnants of specific works that they undertook, who of course needed that kind of protection. But at one point, in order to, bind the Nganga more closely to him, the story went that the guy started feeding the Nganga lines of cocaine. In order to, the idea was to enhance dependency, but of course, as it so happens, the Nganga joined the owner in the kind of fatal pattern of overconsumption that, finally led to, his suppliers and creditors do him in, But that would have been easily interpretable as kind of the kind of thing that you do not do with such